The creak of that rusted metal hinge is a sound I'll never be able to scrub from my brain. It's funny how your life can be a masterpiece one second and a pile of ash the next, all because of a sign staked into a patch of grass you used to mow with pride every Sunday morning. I was sitting in my neighbor's darkened guest room, the curtains drawn just enough so I could see the driveway through a sliver of glass. My heart wasn't just beating, it was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird, heavy and erratic. Then I saw it. The black SUV turned the corner, its headlights cutting through the suburban dusk like twin blades. My breath hitched. This was the moment. This was the collision of the lie she lived and the reality I had built. Before we get into the wreckage, I have to ask, have you ever felt the floor literally drop out from under you? Like you're standing in a room you've known for a decade, but suddenly the walls start melting, and you realize nothing is what it seems. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because I really need to know if I'm the only one who has ever felt this kind of cold, hollow loneliness in a neighborhood full of people. And if you've ever had to find a strength you didn't know you possessed just to keep breathing, hit that subscribe button. We're going to walk through this fire together. The SUV came to a smooth stop. The engine cut out, and for a heartbeat, there was just silence. Then the door opened, and Skylar stepped out. She looked incredible. She was wearing a trench coat that probably cost more than my first car, her hair perfectly blown out. Smelling, I'm sure, like that expensive French perfume she claimed she bought for herself, but I knew was a gift from Harrison. She was laughing at something on her phone, probably a text from him, the man she'd just spent 10 days with under the guise of a strategic partnership summit in London. She looked like a woman who had the world at her feet. Then she looked up. Her laughter didn't just stop, it evaporated. She froze her hand, still gripping the door handle, her eyes locked onto the "For Sale" sign, standing defiantly in front of our porch. I watched her face go from confusion to a pale, sickly shade of gray. She walked toward the sign, her heels clicking on the pavement, the same pavement we spent 3 weekends sealing together 3 years ago. She reached out a hand, touching the cold wood, as if she expected it to disappear. It didn't. The reality was as solid as the oak trees lining our street. How did we get here? How did Bennett, the guy who spent his weekends building a custom pantry for his wife, because she mentioned she liked organization, become the man selling the roof over her head while she was away? We bought this house 6 years ago. It was a disaster mold in the basement wallpaper that looked like it was from a 1970s horror movie and a kitchen that barely functioned. But we were young, and we were us. I remember Skylar sitting on the floor of what would become our living room, eating cheap pizza out of a box, her face smudged with plaster dust, telling me that as long as we had these 4 walls, we had everything. I believed her. I worked double shifts as a contractor to pay for the materials, and I spent every spare hour stripping floors and painting ceilings. Every nail I drove into those boards was a promise. Every room was a chapter of our future. Or so I thought. The shift was subtle at first. A few months after she got the promotion to be Harrison's lead executive assistant, the U.S. started to fade. It started with the late nights. "Harrison needs these reports by morning." "Ben," she'd say, not looking up from her laptop. Then came the weekend retreats. Then the international coordination trips. I wanted to be the supportive husband. I wanted her to shine. I ignored the way she started locking her iPad. I ignored the way she started smelling like expensive gin and cedarwood Harrison's signature scent instead of the vanilla lotion I used to buy her. The discovery wasn't some cinematic moment with a private investigator. It was pathetic, really. Her iPad had been left on the kitchen island, and a notification popped up. It was a photo. A photo of Skylar and Harrison at a rooftop bar, the London Bridge illuminated behind them. They weren't just colleagues. His hand was on the small of her back, and the look in her eyes. It was a look she hadn't given me in years. It was a look of worship. I scrolled. I shouldn't have, but I did. Months of messages. They talked about me like I was a piece of furniture, something reliable but boring, something they'd eventually have to move out of the way so they could start their real life together. The pain was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my lungs that made it hard to swallow. I sat in our kitchen, the kitchen I built, and realized that every sacrifice I made was just a bridge for her to walk over to get to him. She wasn't just cheating, she was discarding me. She was waiting for the right moment to serve me papers and take half of the equity in the house I had bled for. That's when the grief turned into something else. Something colder. Something sharper. I realized I could sit there and wait for her to break my heart on her timeline, or I could take control of the narrative. I called a real estate agent I'd worked with on a few jobs. I need this house sold. Cash offer. Fast. No contingencies. I told him I was moving for work and needed it closed before my wife got back from her trip. Since the house was in my name, a gift from my grandfather's inheritance that I'd used as the down payment, the paperwork was easy. I spent the next 9 days in a blur of motion. I didn't cry. I packed. I moved my essentials into a storage unit and a small temporary apartment across town. I left the furniture, most of it I'd built anyway, and I didn't want the splinters of our past haunting my new space. I wanted the house to look staged, perfect, and completely devoid of us. Now, watching her through that window, I saw her pull out her phone. Her thumbs were flying. My phone, sitting on the bedside table next to me, began to buzz. It vibrated against the wood, a persistent, frantic sound. Skylar. Then again. Skylar. I didn't pick it up. I just watched. She walked up to the front door, her movements jerky and panicked. She fumbled with her keys, her breath coming in visible puffs in the chilly evening air. She jammed the key into the lock, turning it with a force that looked like it might snap the metal. The door swung open, hitting the interior wall with a dull thud. She stepped into the foyer, and I knew exactly what she was seeing. An empty hallway, the smell of industrial cleaner, and the hollow echo of a home that had already been vacated by the soul she thought she could keep in a cage until she was ready to leave. She dropped her designer bags on the hardwood. The sound echoed all the way across the street to where I was sitting. She didn't go further inside yet. She just stood there in the doorway, framed by the light of the hall, her silhouette trembling as she realized the locks hadn't been changed, but the life inside certainly had. She slowly turned back toward the street, looking at the sold sticker the agent had slapped over the sign just an hour ago, her eyes darting around the quiet neighborhood, as if looking for me in the shadows. She took a shuddering breath and slammed the door shut from the inside, the heavy oak muffled by the silence of the street. The heavy thud of the front door closing felt like a gavel hitting a mahogany bench, finalizing a sentence I had spent months drafting in the quiet corners of my mind. From my vantage point across the street, I could see the flick of the foyer lights through the transom window, a pale yellow glow that normally signaled home. But tonight it looked more like the sterile lighting of an interrogation room. Skylar was inside now, walking through a skeletal version of the life she thought she could keep on a leash. I watched her shadow move frantically past the windows. First the living room, then the kitchen, then back again, a trapped ghost in a house that no longer belonged to either of us. My phone vibrated against my thigh, a relentless buzzing insect that refused to die. Skylar. 14 missed calls. Skylar. 3 new voicemails. I didn't need to listen to them to know the pitch of her voice. I could already hear the calculated tremor, the way she'd try to weaponize her confusion to make me feel like the one who had lost his mind. But the iPad photos didn't lie. The saved flight itineraries for S and H to the Maldives next month didn't lie. And the way she'd whispered, "I can't wait to be free of this place. into her phone while she thought I was mowing the lawn that certainly didn't lie. I leaned back into the shadows of the guest room, the smell of my neighbor's lavender potpourri clashing with the bitter adrenaline flooding my tongue. For months, I had been a ghost in my own marriage, a silent observer of my replacement. It started with the strategy dinners that ran until 2 a.m. Harrison, with his silver-templed hair and custom-tailored suits, was everything I wasn't. He didn't have sawdust under his fingernails. He didn't know the exact torque required to set a floor joist. He just knew how to sign checks and promise a world that didn't involve property taxes or leaky faucets. The gaslighting had been a slow-acting poison. Whenever I asked why her phone was face down, she'd sigh that long, exhausted exhale designed to make me feel like a burden. "Bennett, I'm managing a multi-million-dollar merger. I don't have the energy for your insecurities." She'd say it with such conviction that I'd actually apologize. I'd go into the garage and work on a birdhouse or a bookshelf, convincing myself that if I just made our home more beautiful, more perfect, she'd want to stay in it. I was building a golden cage, and all the while she was looking for the bolt cutters. But the strategic summit in London was the final straw. While she was sipping champagne in a first-class pot, I was dismantling our life with surgical precision. I didn't just call a realtor. I called the one guy Harrison hated, a developer named Miller, who had been trying to buy our corner lot for years to build a luxury duplex. I knew Harrison wanted this house. He had mentioned it once at a company BBQ, calling it a charming little starter, while eyeing Skylar. He wanted to buy it out from under me during the divorce, renovate it, and live here with her as a trophy of his conquest. Not on my watch. I sold it to Miller for a cash price that was slightly below market value. Under one condition, the sold sign stayed up the moment the papers were signed, and the closing happened in 72 hours. I wanted her to feel the displacement. I wanted her to understand that the security she thought she was trading me for was a house of cards. Through the window, I saw the upstairs bedroom light snap on. That was the room where I'd spent 3 weeks hand-sanding the floorboards until they were smooth as silk. I could imagine her standing there, looking at the empty space where our bed used to be. I had moved it all. Every frame, every rug, every memory that didn't have her scent on it was gone. I left the things Harrison had bought her, the designer shoes, the jewelry cases, the vanity mirror. They looked pathetic sitting on the bare floor, like trash waiting for a pickup. My phone lit up again. This time, it wasn't Skylar. It was a text from an unknown number. "Bennett, this is Harrison. I don't know what kind of stunt you're pulling with the house, but you're making a massive mistake. We need to talk. Man to man." I let out a short, dry laugh that turned into a cough. Man to man. The irony was thick enough to choke on. This was a man who hid behind HR policies and corporate retreats to sleep with another man's wife, and now he wanted to talk about mistakes. He wasn't worried about Skylar's housing situation. He was worried about the optics. He was worried that his perfect plan to transition Skylar from my house to his was hitting a very public, very messy speed bump. I began to type back my fingers steady for the first time in weeks. "The house is sold. Harrison. I'm sure a man of your means can find her a hotel. Or better yet, ask your wife, Vivian, if she has any room in the penthouse." I didn't send it. Not yet. I had a different role for Vivian in this play, one that didn't involve a snarky text message. Vivian was the one who actually owned the majority stake in Harrison's firm. Harrison was a figurehead, a polished hood ornament on a car Vivian's father had built. If Harrison's indiscretions became a liability to the family brand, he wouldn't just lose Skylar, he'd lose the keys to the kingdom. The streetlights hummed to life, casting long orange shadows across the driveway. I saw Skylar emerge from the front door again. She wasn't crying anymore. She was angry. She was pacing the porch, her phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesticulating wildly. She was likely screaming at Harrison, demanding to know why the locks worked, but the furniture was gone. She looked small. For the first time in our entire relationship, she didn't look like the woman who held my heart in her hands. She looked like a stranger who had trespassed on a construction site. I watched her walk down to the curb, her expensive heels sinking into the soft turf I'd spent all spring fertilizing. She stared at the "sold" sign as if she could set it on fire with her mind. She reached out and yanked at the wooden post, trying to pull it out of the ground, but I'd set it deep. She gave up, kicking the dirt and leaning her head against the cold metal of her SUV. The silence of the neighborhood was eerie. A few neighbors had peered through their blinds, curious about the commotion, but nobody came out. In the suburbs, drama is like a car wreck. Everyone looks, but nobody wants to get blood on their shoes. Skylar was alone. Truly, fundamentally alone. The husband she'd discarded was gone, and the lover she'd bet on was likely sitting in a board meeting or hiding from his wife, unable to come to her rescue without exposing himself. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. Not joy exactly, but a profound sense of equilibrium. The numbness I'd lived with since the iPad discovery was starting to thaw into a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't about being mean. It was about being honest. She wanted a life without me. Fine. This is what it looks like. No safety net. No boring husband to fix the sink or pay the insurance or provide a backdrop for her filtered Instagram life. I stood up from the chair, the old floorboards of my neighbor's house creaking under my boots. It was time to stop watching. I had a meeting across town at a quiet bar, a place where the lighting was dim and the drinks were stiff. I wasn't meeting a lawyer or a realtor this time. I was meeting a woman who had contacted me 3 days ago after she found a set of suspicious hotel receipts in her husband's suit jacket. As I made my way toward the back door of the neighbor's house, to slip out to my car parked in the alley, I took one last look at the monitor on the desk. Skylar was sitting on the top step of the porch, her head in her hands, the "for sale" sign, casting a long yet shadow over her shoulders that looked like a darkened wing. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a cigarette, a habit she'd supposedly quit years ago, and the small, flickering flame of her lighter was the only thing visible in the deepening gloom as she stared into the empty street. The orange cherry of Skylar's cigarette was a tiny, defiant spark in the vast, devouring shadows of our old neighborhood, but I didn't stay to watch the ash fall. I turned my back on the monitor and stepped out into the cool, damp air of the alleyway behind my neighbor's house. Every step away from that "sold" sign felt like shedding a layer of lead skin. I climbed into my truck, the one Skylar used to call the "rust bucket," and felt the familiar vibration of the engine beneath my palms. It was solid. It was real. Unlike the 10 years of marriage I had just liquidated, the drive across town was a blur of neon lights and wet asphalt. I wasn't headed to my new apartment. I was headed to the Gilded Cage, a bar that lived up to its name with its velvet booths and overpriced scotch. It was the kind of place Harrison frequented, the kind of place where men in power went to hide from the consequences of their choices. But tonight, it was the setting for a different kind of summit. I checked my watch. 8:45 p.m. I smoothed down my jacket, feeling the weight of the envelope in my inner pocket. Inside weren't just the iPad photos. I had spent the last 72 hours digging deeper, following a paper trail that Skylar had been too arrogant to cover. She thought she was being clever, using a joint emergency credit card for her dinners with Harrison in London, likely thinking I was too distracted by my construction projects to check the statements. She was right for a long time. But betrayal makes you a very fast learner when it comes to forensic accounting. I walked into the bar, the scent of expensive tobacco and expensive lies hitting me instantly. And there she was. Vivian sat in the furthest corner booth, a glass of amber liquid in front of her. She didn't look like a woman who had just found out her husband was a predator. She looked like a general preparing for a siege, her eyes sharp and unforgiving, locked onto mine the moment I cleared the entryway. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply gestured to the seat across from her. "Bennett," she said, her voice like a cello, deep resonant and slightly mournful. "You look like a man who has spent the last week burning bridges. I admire that. Most people try to fix things that are already shattered. You just swept the glass away." I sat down, the leather creaking under my weight. "I didn't just sweep it, Vivian. I've sold the floor they were standing on." I laid the envelope on the table. No theatrics, no dramatic reveal, just the cold, hard proof of Harrison's strategic partnership with my wife. Vivian didn't even flinch as she flipped through the pages. She looked at a photo of Harrison laughing as he tucked a strand of Skylar's hair behind her ear, and for a split second, a flicker of something disgust perhaps crossed her face. Then it was gone, replaced by that impenetrable corporate mask. "Harrison thinks he's a shark," she murmured, closing the envelope. "But he forgets who owns the ocean. My father didn't build this firm, so a middle manager with a penchant for executive assistants could dismantle our reputation. He's been sloppy, Bennett, not just with your wife, but with the firm's discretionary funds. I suspect he was planning to set Skylar up in one of our corporate-owned suites under the guise of consultancy. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Harrison wasn't just stealing my wife. He was using his wife's money to do it. The arrogance was staggering. "I'm not here for a payout, Vivian," I said, my voice steady despite the roar in my ears. "I want him to feel what I felt when I stood in that empty kitchen. I want him to realize that everything he thinks he owns is just a loan from someone else." Vivian leaned forward, her diamonds catching the dim light of the bar. "Oh, he will. I've already frozen his personal accounts. By tomorrow morning, his keycard won't work at the office. And as for Skylar, she's about to find out that being the muse of a powerful man is a very short-lived career when the man loses his power." We talked for an hour, not about the pain, but about the mechanics of the collapse. Vivian was surgical. She didn't want a messy public divorce. She wanted a quiet, devastating erasure. She was going to strip Harrison of his title, his shares, and his dignity. And I was the one who had handed her the knife. When I left the bar, the rain had started to fall in earnest. I drove back toward the old neighborhood, not to go back inside, but because I knew Skylar would still be there. She was a creature of comfort. She wouldn't know where else to go. As I turned the corner, I saw Harrison's silver Porsche parked crookedly behind Skylar's SUV. The confrontation was happening on the lawn I had mowed, the lawn where we had hosted summer BBQs for people who didn't know the rot behind the siding. I pulled over a block away and walked through the shadows of the neighbor's hedge. The rain was cold, soaking through my shirt, but I didn't care. I needed to see the moment the fantasy died. Skylar was screaming. Not the calculated, manipulative scream she used to get her way, but a raw, animalistic sound. She was throwing a handful of papers at Harrison, likely the notice of sale I had left on the kitchen island. "What do you mean you can't do anything?" she shrieked, her voice cracking in the wet air. "You said you were buying this place. You said we were going to fix it up together. Where am I supposed to go, Harrison? My clothes are in trash bags." Harrison looked smaller than I remembered. His expensive suit jacket was drenched, clinging to his shoulders, making him look like a drowned rat. He was backing away from her toward his car, his hands up in a defensive gesture. "Skylar, keep your voice down, the neighbors are watching," he hissed, his eyes darting toward the houses. "I told you I'm having issues. My accounts are flagged. I can't even get into the corporate suite. There's been a misunderstanding with Vivian." "So, a misunderstanding?" Skylar laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound. "You promised me a life. You said Bennett was a dead weight. You said we were going to London for good." I said we'd talk about it. Harrison snapped his mask of charm, finally slipping to reveal the coward underneath. Look at this place, Skylar. It's a mess. Your husband is a psycho. He sold the house out from under us. I can't be associated with this kind of drama right now. I have a board meeting in the morning. You have a board meeting. Skylar reached out and shoved him, her heel slipping on the mud. I have nothing. He took everything. He packed my things into garbage bags and left them in the rain. She wasn't lying. I had left her designer wardrobe on the back porch covered by a tarp that I knew would leak if the wind picked up. It was a petty move, maybe. But so was sleeping with your boss while your husband was refinishing your vanity. Harrison reached for his car door, his face pale with fear. I'll call you okay. We just need to let this cool down. Go to a hotel. Use your card. The card is declined. Harrison. All of them. Harrison didn't answer. He scrambled into his Porsche and floored it, the tires spinning on the wet pavement, splashing mud all over Skylar's trench coat. He didn't look back. He drove away, leaving her standing in the middle of the street, shivering in the downpour. I stepped out from behind the hedge. I didn't want to hide anymore. I wanted her to see me. Skylar turned, her hair plastered to her face, her makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw the old Skylar, the one who used to eat pizza on the floor and tell me we had everything. Then her eyes hardened. You think you're so smart, don't you? She spat, her voice trembling with cold and rage. You ruined my life. You sold our home. How could you be so cruel? Bennett, we were family. We were a project to you. Skylar, I said, my voice calm, almost detached. I was the foundation you used while you were building your real life with him. But you forgot one thing about foundations. If you crack them too many times, the whole structure comes down. I loved you, she sobbed, though even she didn't seem to believe it. In my own way, I did. No, I replied, walking toward my truck. You loved the house, you loved the security, and you loved the idea that I would always be here to catch you if you fell. But I'm not a safety net anymore. I'm just a guy who knows how to read a balance sheet. I got into the truck and started the engine. Skylar ran to the window, pounding on the glass with her fists. Bennett, don't leave me here. Where am I supposed to go? Please, it's cold. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing. No anger, no hate, just a profound, echoing emptiness. The woman I had built a life for didn't exist. She was a character I had invented to fill a house. Now that the house was gone, the character was fading too. I put the truck in gear and slowly pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, I could see her standing under the glow of the streetlight, a small, shivering figure in a soaked trench coat surrounded by black trash bags and a sign that said, "Someone else owned the ground beneath her feet." I didn't head to my new apartment. I didn't head back to the bar. I just drove. I drove toward the edge of the city where the houses were smaller and the streets were darker, watching the rain wash the last remnants of us off my windshield. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, a text from Vivian. It's done. Check the news at 8 a.m. I reached out and turned off the phone, the silence of the cabin wrapping around me like a blanket. I pulled into a 24-hour diner, the smell of grease and cheap coffee calling to me. I walked inside, sat at the counter, and ordered a plate of eggs. The waitress, an older woman with a name tag that said, Marge, looked at my soaked shirt and messy hair. Rough night, sugar, she asked, setting a mug of coffee in front of me. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, the steam rising into my face. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window of the diner. For the first time in months, I recognized the man looking back. No, Marge, I said, taking a sip of the bitter hot liquid. Actually, I think it's the first quiet night I've had in years. I sat there for hours watching the truckers come and go, watching the clock on the wall tick toward a morning that didn't involve Skylar Harrison or a house full of lies. I felt a strange, humming energy in my limbs, the kind of energy you get when you finally clear a site for a new build. The old structure was gone. The debris was hauled away. Now there was just the dirt, the blueprints, and the long, slow work of building something that actually had a chance of standing. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I paid my bill and walked back to the truck. The rain had stopped, leaving the world smelling of ozone and wet earth. I pulled out my laptop, opening a file I hadn't looked at in weeks, the plans for the small lakeside cabin I'd always dreamed of building for myself. I scrolled through the drawings, my mind already calculating the lumber I'd need, the way the light would hit the deck in the afternoon. I tapped the steering wheel, a slow, steady rhythm. The revenge was over. The justice was served. But the transformation, that was only just beginning. I pulled out of the diner parking lot, the sun finally breaking through the clouds, reflecting off the hood of my truck as I pointed the wheels toward the mountains. Behind me, the city was waking up to the news of a corporate scandal and a "for sale" sign that had finally done its job. Ahead of me, there was nothing but the open road and the quiet, steady sound of my own breathing. I reached into the glove box and pulled out the old tattered photo of Skylar and me on our wedding day. I looked at our smiling faces, two people who had no idea what they were building. I didn't tear it up. I didn't burn it. I simply set it down on the passenger seat, let out a long, slow breath, and reached for the gear shift as the truck began to climb the first steep grade of the canyon road. The mountain air was a different kind of cold than the damp, suffocating chill of the suburbs. It was sharp, antiseptic, and tasted like pine needles and untapped potential. I pulled my truck over to a small turnout overlooking the valley, as the sun finally climbed high enough to burn away the remaining morning mist. Below me, the city looked like a toy, set miles of interconnected lives, secrets, and houses that people spent their entire existences trying to protect. I looked down at the passenger seat. That wedding photo, the one of two strangers named Bennett and Skylar, felt like a relic from a sunken ship. I picked it up. One last look at the girl who used to laugh at my bad jokes, and the man who thought a mortgage was a vow. With a flick of my wrist, I let it go. I didn't wait to see where the wind took it. I just watched it flutter out of sight, a tiny white speck disappearing into the vast green canopy of the canyon. My laptop chimed from the center console. I didn't even have to open the browser to know what was happening. Vivian had kept her word. The headlines were starting to ripple through the business wires: executive shakeup at Harrison, and associates managing director ousted amidst financial discrepancies and misconduct allegations. There were no mentions of Skylar by name. Vivian was too classy for that. But the misconduct was a scarlet letter that would follow Harrison into every boardroom in the country. He hadn't just lost his job, he'd lost his currency. I felt a strange, quiet hum in my chest. It wasn't the fiery rush of spite I'd felt a week ago. It was the steady, rhythmic pulse of a man who had finally balanced his own books. I drove further up the mountain until I reached the trailhead of a property I'd bought with the last of my personal savings, a rugged 5-acre plot of land that overlooked a glacial lake. There was no "for sale" sign here. There was no blueprint for a perfect suburban life. There was just the raw earth and the silence of the wilderness. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. I walked to the edge of the clearing where the ground dropped off toward the water. I thought about Skylar, probably sitting in some budget motel room right now, staring at her reflection in a cracked mirror, wondering how the man she called boring had managed to dismantle her world with a single wooden sign. I wondered if she'd finally realized that she hadn't been choosing between two men. She'd been choosing between a person who built things and a person who consumed them. But those thoughts were like echoes in a distant valley, faint and fading. I reached into the bed of my truck and pulled out my tool belt. The leather was worn, the hammer loop frayed, but it felt right against my hip. I wasn't here to build a palace. I was here to build a sanctuary. I took a deep breath, the scent of the lake filling my lungs, and looked at the pile of lumber I'd had delivered the day before. Every board was a new start. Every nail was a commitment to a life that didn't require a mask. Have you ever had to tear everything down just to see if the ground was still solid? It's terrifying. It's lonely. But standing here with the sun on my back and the hammer in my hand, I realized that the "for sale" sign wasn't an end. It was a declaration of independence. If you've ever felt like you were drowning in a life that wasn't yours, I want you to know that it's never too late to walk away. It's never too late to sell the house of lies and buy a plot of truth. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you build if you had nothing left to lose? How would you rewrite your story if the first chapter was burned to ash? And if you found strength in my journey, hit that subscribe button. We're not just telling stories here. We're rebuilding from the ground up. I knelt down, picked up a piece of cedar, and ran my thumb along the grain. It was rough, honest, and ready. I didn't need a designer kitchen or a corporate title to feel whole. I just needed the work. The silence of the mountain was broken only by the first strike of my hammer against a fresh stake. The sound echoed across the water, clear and sharp, signaling the start of a project that would finally, for the first time in my life, belong entirely to me. I looked up at the sky, a vast, unbroken blue, and smiled. The house was sold. The debt was paid. And Bennett was finally home. I stood up, wiping the sweat from my brow with the back of my hand, and looked out over the lake. The water was still as glass, reflecting the mountains, and the sky in perfect symmetry. I picked up my level, checked the first line of the foundation, and felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. The past was a ghost, a shadow in the rearview mirror. The future was right here in the smell of the wood and the strength of my own two hands. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long golden fingers across the clearing, I didn't think about the SUV in the rain or the dark hallway of the suburban house. I thought about the first fire I'd build in the hearth of this cabin. I thought about the quiet mornings drinking coffee on a porch that I'd built with my own sweat. I thought about the man I was becoming, the man who didn't need a house to be a home. I reached for the next board, my movements fluid and sure. The rhythm of the work was a prayer, a meditation, a healing. With every swing of the hammer, I was driving the ghosts further into the shadows. With every measurement, I was reclaiming a piece of my soul. The world might have seen a man who lost his wife and his house, but I saw a man who had finally found his foundation. I worked until the stars began to peek through the canopy, the cool night air settling over the mountain like a velvet cloak. I climbed into the back of my truck, wrapping myself in a heavy wool blanket, and looked up at the constellations. They were constant. They were true, just like the earth beneath me. I closed my eyes, the sound of the lake lapping against the shore, a lullaby for a man who no longer had anything to hide. The "for sale" sign was gone. The betrayal was a closed book. And as I drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, I knew that when the sun rose tomorrow, it wouldn't be shining on a victim. It would be shining on a creator. The first light of dawn touched the top of the pines, and I woke up before the alarm. I didn't need a phone to tell me it was time to start. I stepped out of the truck, the frost crunching under my feet, and looked at the skeleton of the cabin taking shape in the early light. It was small, it was humble, but it was mine. I picked up the hammer, the cold metal warming in my grip, and went back to work. There were no more stories to tell, no more drama to chase. There was just the wood, the nails, and the quiet, steady beat of a heart that had finally learned how to beat for itself. The mountain held its breath as I drove the final stake of the foundation into the earth, a solid, immovable anchor in a world that was always shifting. I stood back, wiped my hands on my jeans, and looked at the horizon. The journey was long and the price was high, but as I stood there in the silence of my own making, I knew I'd pay it all over again, just for this one moment of peace. The sold sign was the best thing I ever bought.